When I was a sophomore in high school, my little sister Kelly was a freshman. We attended a relatively small school. Our gym teacher was named Mr. Green, and he was probably in his late 20s or early 30s. Because they were short-staffed in this particular year, some of the freshmen and sophomores had gym class together. Gym class was about an hour, and for the first half we would do actual exercise, and in the second half we would sit in a classroom and learn health. There were about 30 kids in our class. Mr. Green was a good-looking man, who I knew many of the girls had crushes on. I never felt that way. To me, he was just the man who made us run laps until we were practically gasping for breath. It wasn't that I wasn't fit, but I just wasn't a very athletic kid, and I hated working out. Kelly was completely different. She was on the varsity soccer team and was incredibly talented. She was also far more outgoing and talkative than I was. It didn't take me long to notice that Mr. Green seemed to favor her, not only over me, but over everyone. It started early into the school year when Kelly forgot her gym clothes one day. We wore skirts and collared shirts as our uniform, so bringing gym clothes was necessary if you were going to even participate that day. I braced myself for Mr. Green to go off on her. I knew that one of his pet peeves was forgetting gym clothes. Plus, since you couldn't participate, you would also get a 0% grade for that day. I watched nervously as Kelly approached him and confessed that she had no gym clothes to wear. Much to my surprise, Mr. Green only laughed and told her he had an extra pair in his office, which he then gave to her. She thanked him several times, then ran to go get changed. I wasn't the only one surprised by this. If that would have been anyone else, he would have ripped her a new one, I heard one person say. It was true. A few weeks later, a different girl forgot her gym clothes, and Mr. Green scolded her for not being responsible, then had her go sit in the health classroom to work on homework. She was given a 0% for the day and was embarrassed in front of everyone. The next thing I noticed was that he was way less hard on Kelly than other people. On days when she was extra tired from soccer practice the day before, he would let her get out of doing the workout that day. He would tell her to just go get a water break, which really just turned into her sitting on the sidelines and playing with her phone while the rest of us had to work our butts off. Then one day we were in the health portion of the class and in the middle of a test about the skeletal system. I noticed that Kelly had raised her hand, signifying that she had a question. Mr. Green walked over to her and she said something to him. He then whispered something in her ear and she quickly began writing. I don't know what was said, but my intuition told me that he had given her an answer. This was not something he would do for anyone else. I wasn't jealous, but I was definitely annoyed that she was getting special treatment. I never brought it up to her, not wanting it to cause a fight. One afternoon, Kelly and I were sitting at the kitchen table and going through our homework. Kelly's health folder was open and I saw our latest test sitting inside. 100% was written at the top of the paper, along with a smiley face and a little red heart. This immediately made me suspicious, and I asked Kelly about it, saying, "This is a little weird, don't you think?" But she just brushed it off and told me he was just being nice. She then quickly closed her folder. The heart was the final straw that made me suspect that there was probably something more going on than what meets the eye. I decided I was going to do a little investigating of my own. The next day, while Kelly was off at soccer practice and my parents weren't home from work yet, I decided to peek around Kelly's room to see if there was anything of interest connected to Mr. Green. Her room was kind of cluttered, so I didn't really know where to start. I checked in her jewelry box, but there was nothing in there that I hadn't seen before. I then checked under her bed and in the drawers of her desk. All of a sudden, something caught my eye. It was a tin box, the kind that chocolates would come in. I felt a little bad about invading my sister's privacy, but I needed answers, and I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. I opened the box and found some carefully folded up notes. I opened them up and quickly discovered that there were letters addressed to Kelly and that they were from Mr. Green. In the letters, he talked about how he couldn't help but stare at her beautiful face while she was in class and that he could barely concentrate on teaching. He told her how pretty she looked when she had worn her hair in 2 braids the other day. He then went on to say that he couldn't wait until the day she turned 18 and they could run away together. I was shocked and disgusted. My sister was no more than 15 years old at the time. I grabbed my phone and snapped pictures of the letters. I then put them back where I had found them. I knew I had to tell my parents. I also knew that this was going to be a major problem. After all, Mr. Green was committing a crime, and this was super serious. I was also scared of getting Kelly in trouble or embarrassing her. That night when my parents were home from work and Kelly was studying at a friend's house, I told my parents that I had something important to tell them. They looked at me, concern visible on their faces. I then told them everything I knew about Kelly and Mr. Green. They were, of course, devastated. They asked me if I knew if Kelly and Mr. Green had been physical together, and I told them I didn't know anything about that. What followed was even messier than I had expected. My parents called the police, and there was a whole investigation. They reviewed security footage at the school and determined that Kelly and Mr. Green had been kissing after hours at school. He was promptly fired from his position. He was given community service and probation and was asked to never contact Kelly again. Because Kelly was a minor, she was not named in any of the legal reports. This meant that technically no one at school knew that she was the one that Mr. Green had been messing around with. But because they had been so close, a lot of people speculated. As for Kelly, she was heartbroken and directed her anger at me for telling our parents. She avoided me and didn't speak to me for weeks after. She blamed me for the reason that she and Mr. Green weren't together. We were always somewhat distant after that. But then the anonymous texts started coming. I would get strange texts from an unknown number every few weeks. They would say things like, "Does it feel good breaking up a relationship?" and "You stuck your nose where it doesn't belong." I assumed that they were coming from Mr. Green, but I had no proof. Then one morning before school, I opened up my locker and got the shock of a lifetime. A dead rat was hanging in my locker. A note was attached that read, "A rat for a rat." This time, I knew I had to do something. I hurried to the front office and asked to speak with the principal. I told him about the rat and the strange texts I had been getting. He assured me that he would check the security footage. I got called back down to the office later in the day, and sure enough, Mr. Green was seen entering the school and placing something in my locker. They notified the police, and Mr. Green was ordered not to talk to me anymore and faced additional charges for harassment. I was able to finish the last year and a half of high school relatively peacefully and eventually went off to college. One day, shortly after Kelly's 18th birthday, I got a call from my mom. I could tell that she was very upset about something. She told me that Kelly was talking to Mr. Green again, and because she was now 18, there was nothing that could be done about it. I was shocked that Kelly would want to date someone older than her by more than 10 years, and especially felt hurt that she would do so after what Mr. Green did to me. My parents' disapproval did nothing to stop Kelly's relationship. Several years went by, and when she was in college, she and Mr. Green eloped and got married. They remain married still, and they have very limited contact with our family. When I was in high school, I had this math teacher named Mr. Tate. He was probably in his mid-40s, and he was married with 2 children. I didn't have anything against him except the fact that he was teaching my least favorite subject, algebra. I was absolutely terrible at math, and it was my worst grade. One semester, it was particularly bad. I was bringing home failed test after failed test. It wasn't that I wasn't trying. I was trying very hard and would spend hours studying before each exam. It was like trying to understand another language to me. It just didn't make sense, and I felt like I was drowning in confusion. How badly I was doing in algebra was beginning to affect my GPA, something that was incredibly important at the time because I would be applying to colleges soon. My parents were turning up the pressure on me, saying that I had to find a way to get my grade up before midterms. At the end of algebra the next day, I was putting away my things and Mr. Tate walked over to me and asked if he could speak with me for a moment. I said yes. He quietly asked if I would start coming by for an hour or so after school and he would tutor me. He said he was sure he could get my grade up. An extra hour at school learning a subject I hated did not sound very desirable. But I was desperate, so of course I said yes. At the end of the day, I texted my mom that I would be late coming home from school and then made my way to Mr. Tate's room. He was the only one in the room and the halls were basically empty, so I left the door open. But before I could be seated, he asked me to close the door so any noise from the hallway wouldn't cause a distraction. I did as I was told, not thinking anything of it. He then had me sit in a chair nearby his desk. He took out one of my more recent tests and began going through it question by question, explaining the mistakes I made. He would then have me try to resolve the problem myself. I couldn't help but notice that when he handed me a pencil or was pointing to something on the paper, his hand would frequently brush against mine. Then when I got a question correct, he patted my back in a congratulatory way. While I initially thought it was odd, I figured I was probably just reading too much into it. When the hour was up, I thanked him and headed home. Over the next few weeks, I noticed something different about Mr. Tate. He had gotten a new haircut that made him look younger and began dressing differently. He even began wearing aftershave, something I only know because my chair was placed so close to him when he tutored me. If I didn't know he was married, I would almost think he was trying to impress someone. One day when I showed up for tutoring, he was in a particularly good mood. He welcomed me into the classroom and told me that he had very exciting news for me. I could not imagine what that could mean. When I sat down, he placed a piece of paper in front of me. I glanced at it and realized that it was the quiz I had taken the day before. There was an A- printed at the top of the paper. I was stunned. I had not even managed to get a B- on anything in the class the whole semester. While the tutoring seemed to be helping a lot, I still knew that I had guessed on a good portion of the answers on that exam. I couldn't believe how that grade could possibly be accurate, but of course I wasn't going to say anything. I was already internally celebrating while thinking about the grade boost this would mean for me. I began to open up my textbook like I always did at the start of one of our tutoring sessions, but Mr. Tate reached out to stop me. He told me that such a good grade after all my hard work deserves a reward. He then reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a container of chocolates. They were the nice kind, the ones you had to pay good money for. I was quite taken aback. Of course, I had teachers who had given me candy and snacks before, but normally it was everyone in the class who got it, not just me individually. I supposed it was just Mr. Tate's way of congratulating me on my grades, so I hesitantly took the candy and thanked him. As time went on, I noticed that Mr. Tate would spend less time during our tutoring sessions talking about math and more time asking me questions about my life. He asked me about how many siblings I had and what I liked to do for fun. He even asked me what music I liked to listen to. I told him the name of one of my favorite bands. The next day, he told me he had listened to their music and explained which songs were his favorite. I couldn't understand what he was doing or why he cared so much about my life. I was just like any other 17-year-old girl he would have in class. At the end of our last tutoring session before Thanksgiving break, he stood up when I did and reached out his arms for a hug. I was pretty sure that teachers were not allowed to hug students, so I hesitated, a bit uncomfortable. Mr. Tate sensed my hesitancy and got a strange look on his face. It was almost like anger. I reluctantly hugged him, and when I did, he held me tight and whispered in my ear. He said, "I knew you appreciated how much I've been helping you out with your grade lately." The way he said it was unusual. It almost felt like he was holding something over my head and threatening to take it away if I did not do as he wanted. He was right. I did appreciate how much he had been helping me. My grade in the class had risen dramatically since he began tutoring me. My parents were off my back and my GPA was back on track. Things were finally looking up. Still, I had the suspicion that Mr. Tate had some sort of bad intent. It didn't seem normal for him to be interested in getting to know me. After all, he wasn't getting anything out of tutoring me. It wasn't like I was paying him. That whole Thanksgiving break, I did my best to forget about school and focus on being with my family. But I couldn't help but think about Mr. Tate's words on the last day of school. I found myself dreading Monday, and even more dreading seeing him again. I considered telling him I didn't need to be tutored anymore, but I was afraid he would punish me with a bad grade if I didn't keep attending. It was a situation in which I felt trapped. I couldn't tell anyone about my suspicions because I didn't want to start any drama. Plus, I knew if I told my parents, they might call the school and get Mr. Tate in trouble. When I went back to school on Monday, I could see Mr. Tate watching me closely during class. The feeling made me so uncomfortable that I could feel a panic attack coming on. When school was over that day, I went to his room to tell him that I wasn't feeling well and couldn't do tutoring that day. He quickly became angry and told me that I needed to toughen up and think of my grades. I shook my head and told him I really didn't feel well. I then turned to leave the room, but he grabbed me by my backpack, holding me back. Just then, another teacher from down the hall knocked on the door to ask Mr. Tate a question. He immediately released me and I raced out the door. I burst into tears the second I got into my car. I drove home immediately and told my parents everything. They were very angry, but not at me. What happened next was pretty much exactly what I anticipated. They called the school and notified the police. I had to tell the police every detail of what had gone on, and at the end, Mr. Tate was promptly fired and court ordered never to talk to me again. I was given a new algebra teacher to finish out the semester with. Sure enough, I passed the class with a B+. When I was in high school, I played on the tennis team. This meant that every day after school, I would have to go to the women's locker room, change out of my uniform, and put on the tennis outfit. One day, I went to the locker room to get dressed like I always did, and I was running late, so I was in a hurry. I got to my locker and quickly unlocked it and swung the door open. I pulled out my tennis bag, which contained all my clothes, my tennis gear, and things like deodorant, perfume, and feminine products. While the locker was still open, I stripped off my uniform and then pulled my tennis outfit on. I stuffed all of my clothes back into the gym bag and placed it back into my locker. I grabbed my tennis racket and prepared to shut my locker when all of a sudden my eye caught something strange. It was something round and metallic stuck in the back of my locker that I had never seen before. I reached out to grab it and realized that it was magnetic, and that was how it was sticking to the metal wall of the locker. I examined it and quickly recognized it from a news story I had seen recently. It was a miniature spy camera. My heart dropped as I realized I had just gotten nearly completely naked while this device had been recording me. I did the only thing I could think of, which was to take it outside and give it to my tennis coach. When I handed it to him and told him where I had found it, he became enraged. He told me not to worry. He would turn it into the police and they would find the little creep that had placed it there. I ended up skipping practice and going home early because I felt so violated by the whole event. I 100% thought that the camera had been placed in my locker by a male student. I assumed it was done to make fun of me. I kept picturing the guy sitting around with all of his friends and laughing at me, watching me get undressed. The whole thing made me sick. Boy, did I guess wrong. While I was having dinner with my family the following night, my parents received a phone call from the police. They explained that they had reviewed security footage and they saw our history teacher, Mr. Albert, entering the women's locker room the night before. When they confronted him about it, he admitted it immediately. He said that he had put the hidden camera in many girls' lockers, but I was just the first person to notice it. Luckily, the device was destroyed before he ever had the disgusting privilege of watching me get undressed. Mr. Albert was of course fired and later arrested for this crime. He is now behind bars where I hope he will remain for a very, very long time. Sleep tight.